There we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We'll just wait for a few more people to come in here. We just opened it up, so we've got a bunch of folks joining. So we'll just give them a few more minutes, 2 or 3 more minutes here to get everybody in this session. But thank you for joining, and we're looking forward to it. Okay, well, we'll get started. I think being on time is important. As those that come in a little bit later, they can catch up on the recording. But as I've said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those of you, no matter where you are in the world. My name is Daniel Protz. I'm the founder and CEO of FlavorWiki, and we are really excited to have you here today to talk a little bit about our patented descriptive profiling approach, which we've been working on for really as long as the company has been in existence. But we just had the patent granted last year, and we're then taking the opportunity to talk a little bit more publicly about it. I've got a few other people here with me who will introduce to you shortly, but just to get going a little bit, this is going to be actually a part one. We're not going to be able to get through all of the aspects of the methodology that we're interested to share, and we feel that people may want to go into a little bit more detail about it over time. So we're calling this part one, but we'll be nevertheless covering the basics of the methodology. Next slide, please. So what is really the purpose here? We'd like to explain what it is. You know, we talk a lot about the paired question. Maybe you've heard about it in and around the industry a little bit. We haven't been too forward about it. We worked with our clients with it fair amount. Some of them are who I see here today. But we'd like to explain what it does. I would like to share the story about how we got into this idea, or how I got into this idea. As some of you may know, I'm not a sensory scientist or consumer scientist, nevertheless, I'm the founder of the company. And then we want to talk about how we validated what we do, how we understand that the results are usable, what we've learned about where they can be applied and where they can't be applied, and generally talk about like what we're doing next and what we're doing now to continue to develop this methodology, because we do see a lot of promise in it in terms of building into this agile digital age of sensory science and consumer science. Next slide, please. First, just a few words to introduce the people in our team who are going to be here helping us to present this. As I mentioned myself, my name is Daniel Protz. I'm the founder and CEO. I don't have a food background outside of FlavorWiki at all. I'm both proud and coy to say that, but it is true. I started my career in the banking industry about 25 years ago. Worked at Goldman for a while. I've worked in computer-driven trading, so I'm very comfortable most of my career being around data. Did my MBA at Stanford in 2007 before coming over here to Europe, originally from America, and been living in Switzerland, in Zurich, Switzerland, where I'm based now for the past 15 years. I've done a fair amount of work in e-commerce space. I ran the business for Groupon, which is some people might remember it. It's still around. It was a large global e-retailer that was popular between 2010 and 2018. But my background is not in food, and we're going to talk a little bit about how I ended up stumbling into this area a little bit later. And for that, I'll hand it over to Marcia, who's the next person who's going to be involved in the session today.
Thanks, Daniel. Marcia Young, I'm a senior advisor with FlavorWiki, and my background is in food science and technology from the University of Rhode Island. But I worked in the food industry for over 40 years, and I retired in 2020. And I work with Daniel on an advisory basis to help advance the technology as we move into this digital age. So I'm happy to be here.
Hi, everyone. And I'm Elli Alexandraki. I'm based in Greece, and I'm with FlavorWiki approximately the last 2 years, and I support the design and execution of our market research projects, and also our sensory developments in our FlavorWiki tool, in our FlavorWiki software. So my studies were at Wageningen University. I have studied sensory science. I have my master's degree from the Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And then I moved in the UK and worked for a few years as a panel leader and panel manager there, and worked with many product categories. After that, for a few years, I was also working as a sensory consultant, and I was supporting sensory labs to build up their techniques and methodologies around sensory. And yeah, and now with FlavorWiki.
Great, thank you. Next slide. So just a little bit about FlavorWiki. We're going to kind of breeze through this, but you know, you're here to talk about this profiling method we have, but of course this is part of a larger capability. We are a platform which we use to do research for clients on behalf of clients, but then also we license that platform, which includes this paired question methodology, to food and ingredient companies around the world that use it both internally and for doing tests with their own consumer groups and various areas. We are able to work in over 100 countries. We have a consumer community of over 1 million people. Most of our work has been around the world, but in kind of 50 top countries. We tend to work with multinationals, but we've worked also with small startups. We're very data-driven approach to what we do. And we're looking really for, you know, client partners that are helping us to evolve our methodologies of making research faster, more cost-effective, et cetera. Next slide. So sometimes people ask us, like, what is it we do and why is it important? So we started with what we determine is kind of this tip of the iceberg, which is sensory and, you know, the hedonic understanding of a product, whether or not consumers like it, it doesn't meet expectations. As we built out the platform, we realized that in order to execute this, we needed to have also our own consumer community. And we needed to be able to recruit those people and to allow them to take studies and surveys and buy products in the store and things like this. And so as we've evolved, we also look at what we call the below the surface part, which is sometimes not as well respected in the research that sensory scientists do, but it is nevertheless important for the ultimate outcome, which is, you know, people loving the product and buying it. So we look at a lot of things like shopping experience, packaging, brand awareness, and all of this is put into models that we then use to help customers understand how they can adapt their product or their offering to make it more successful. But if you're dealing with food and beverage, or even products that are things like pharma or CPG products like cleaning supplies and things like this, of course, the sensory aspect of it makes these products very unique. It makes them very different than something like a piece of electronics that you're using. And so understanding that sensory component was, of course, from the beginning, something that was super important and obviously critical for building out this kind of understanding. And so that's why we came up with this paired question, which we'll go into more in detail later.
And Daniel, just to also point out that those things below the iceberg, many of them need to be tested in context, which is why the FlavorWiki approach can be very useful in learning about those things.
Yeah, thanks for that, Marcia. We'll get into that a bit more. But in fact, as you'll see, if Carla can go to the next slide, we tend to do most of these things in what we call in contextual situations. So we do work in CLTs, in kind of these sanitized testing environments. We do more and more of that type of work over time. And we do blinded studies that are even in home. But a lot of what we do and what we really focus our kind of predictive model building and some of our internal research on is the full consumer experience. And that includes the customer understanding the brand, understanding the product, seeing the marketing assets, the advertisements, interacting with the product in terms of knowing about it for the first time, and then finally going to the store and trying it and seeing, you know, do they like it? Are they then going to repurchase it? We even do a lot of repurchase validation because, as many of you I'm sure know, the consumer might say that they're going to repurchase something or they won't, but it's not really possible to validate that in a lot of cases. Because we have our own consumer community, we're able to revalidate this at later time to really try to, you know, strengthen the conclusions of what we're coming up with. But the general execution of where we and how we collect our data from a consumer in the world is that they go out and they purchase it online in the store. They collect information about that purchase journey, whether it's videos, images, or questions being asked, and then they're answering questions while using the product, and that's where this profiling component comes in as well. Next slide. As I said, like we really try to emphasize this in context. You know, we do blind testing. There's definitely a place for blind testing. We understand that, but the world is moving so quickly. And as we'll see a little bit later, my background really coming out of the e-commerce space was all about, you know, how are people using something? Where are they using it? How are they using it? What are they experiencing when they're using that? So we look at a lot of information that is getting given to us while the consumer is using it, whether it's at the gym or in their home, or they're cooking it, or if they're on the go in a quick serve restaurant. We have an application in a smartphone that allows them to do that evaluation wherever they are. And we then also reward them really very small amounts of money for doing those, but we nevertheless do incentivize them just enough to get the right people to do the project. But we really focus on this, like what's happening in that moment, which we believe is more indicative of how quickly the consumer's preferences and things are moving. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we work pretty much all over the world. The Central African nations are a little bit less digitally capable because of internet connectivity, but more or less we have community and have done projects in the countries that you see in green. And you'll see that that's a key component of also the methodology, is that we can kind of make it happen anywhere, not being beholden to a particular geographic location like a testing center. Next slide. So the key thing that we're going to talk about today, this is just an introduction to it. This is what, you know, we filed a patent some years ago, but we had it granted last year after, you know, quite a bit of back and forth, and then also quite a bit of development. So the basic concept behind this is that consumers, if you ask them to rate or scale a descriptive component of a product, like let's say it's crunchy, if it's in the case of texture, there is no contextual knowledge that a regular person has to understand what that scale should be. They are able to make some maybe qualitative responses to that. They might not even understand what crunchy means. Or if you ask them to articulate something in a qualitative response, you get usually open-ended questions or open-ended answers, which tend to be kind of the same level of depth and tend to be kind of the same level of you know, noise, if you will. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to be able to create something that regular people could answer, and that would be able to allow us to use math and machine learning to mimic what are we getting in terms of differences between products and differences between attributes. And we came up with this idea, which we call the paired question. It was actually based on some sociology research that was done at Princeton, where the idea is that we will give people only two choices. We will say, look, there's one thing or the other. We do require that they understand in general what those two things are so that they can at least compare them. But we tell them which one of these two things, if it's texture, if it's flavor, which one of these two flavors, which one of these two textures is stronger to you. And we ask them to answer. We don't ask them to think about it too much. We'll get into some more detail about how we do sometimes ask them to think about it. But it's kind of like a Tinder type of idea, swipe left or right. And we are able to give then the tool a specific set of attributes which are germane to that category, which might even be the attributes that the client really is using also internally. And then of course we can do it in different spoken languages. So it makes the data collection very agile and very flexible. We'll go into that a little bit later, where we talk about how we can mix and match many of these attributes. But what we end up with is a huge data set of various pair votes, meaning A versus B, B versus D, C versus E. And we are distributing these questions across a large group of people. Usually it's a group of consumers, which might be between 60 and 120 or even up to 300 people. And they're all tasting the same product. which we do validate how they're doing that. We'll go into that later. And then from this complex set of binomial distributions, we have trained a machine learning algorithm to create these profiles, which after a lot of testing, which we'll go into, we find to be in general about 85 to 90% as accurate as a trained panel. However, there are some limitations on the depth of the attributes that we can use, and Marcia will get into that a little bit later. But ultimately, then we're able to use this data to model many of the same types of models of preference analysis, ideal profiling that I'm sure many of you on the call are familiar with. You know, correlation analysis, PLS analysis, and this allows us to gather this data very, very quickly. I mean, we're talking about we can gather thousands of data points in the matter of a few days. It's just a matter of how many of our consumer group that we expose this to. And we're able to then aggregate this very quickly and then run analysis on it, which we have found almost always is congruent with the analysis that's done in more traditional settings, like having a trained panel plus hedonic responses. So it's a very brief overview of it. We'll go into more detail of it later, but that's essentially what we integrate into many of our questionnaires to get this information. Next slide. Okay, so we do still work with sensory data. So we're not in of the mindset that this is a replacement to sensory information. Sometimes we'll work with a case where it's not practical to develop a sensory panel because of the time and cost involved. But oftentimes, if we have access to data that is trained panel data, we'll also integrate it into the same model building, and we'll therefore get a contextual understanding of what's driving preference from that consumer descriptive point of view, as well as the technical trained panel point of view. Okay, so that's a brief overview. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about how this all got started, and then we're going to go into a little bit more detail, and Marcia and Elli are going to back me up on that. So next slide, please. So as I said, I don't have a background in food science or any of this type of thing. When I was working at Groupon, I was running their marketing and inventory in Europe. So it included about 9 countries. We were selling a lot of product online. It was almost €1 billion in revenue. Some of that was food. And I had the interest in seeing whether or not we could use descriptive information, like how bitter is a chocolate bar or how soft is a sweater, to understand better what are consumers buying, why are they buying it, and how could we therefore target products in our marketing efforts to specific consumers. So my original thought process was, you know, this is a really interesting information, which is not in a normal CRM. I mean, I know that I have a customer that bought something that was black or blue, but I don't really know if that was the reason they bought it, or if there's some other aspect of the product's attributes that are the reason they bought it. So we came at this from that perspective. I was fortunate enough to have a network of people in the flavoring industry here in Switzerland. And as I explained more this idea, kind of searching for potentially technologies or methods that were out there to already do this, it became clear that what I was describing was something that was also used in their traditional kind of research or their methodology of getting this data or the type of data that they were using. As I started to understand what traditional panels were and how they worked, it was, you know, clear, I think, the value of those. But of course, the scalability of that, if you want to talk about being able to understand like an entire market, you know, at the scale you need to understand that. If you're selling online, you're talking about thousands of different SKUs. It was clearly not scalable. And so this was the problem, is that I thought that we could do something that could scale geographically and that could also give us standardized information to be able to feed models versus what was much more specific and detail oriented around a trained panel. And the question was whether or not we could leverage the crowd to do that. So the next slide, please. What I tried to do then is I created a prototype using this methodology of these opposite comparisons, and we just collected the very basic information, and we went out and found probably 15 or 20 people online in those 4 countries that you see there, the United States, Britain, Philippines, and Brazil. And we had them all go out and buy the Toblerone chocolate bar, which at least at that time was made in one single factory. So there was no variation in the formula across those countries. And what we found is that we could get very repeatable results by having not only people do these tests one day after another or 1 week after another, or also between each other, but that the other thing that I found is that people that had some experience in culinary work, like chefs, were more consistent, but that once we got to a large enough sample size, actually these inconsistencies between the different testers, taking out some of the big outliers of the inconsistent ones, we were able to get something which was very robust also statistically. And so at this stage, I was kind of like, well, maybe this could work because obviously we can collect this data very, very quickly. Next slide. This is where then about in 2018, I was very fortunate to meet Marcia, and then I'll let Marcia introduce herself. We've obviously done a lot of work, also early work with many different companies, some of which you see there. Some were in fresh vegetables, some were in flavors, some were in dairy. It was all different types of products where, customers were interested to try this and see if it worked. But mostly, I think they were interested in us just gathering data, hedonic information about the products. And it's only been very recently that we've been able to really fully develop this capability. But Marcia was a huge part in this during her time in Mondelez, so I'll let her take over and tell a little bit about that experience.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so during my tenure at Mondelez, there was a separate breakthrough innovation group. And they heard Daniel speak at a Kickstarter, and they came back and said, oh, you really should take a look at this. There's some interesting work that this man is doing and the research that he had done to work on gaining consumer preferences and evaluations online. And I thought, well, okay, let me have a chat and see where we go. When Daniel came to visit me, I was quite intrigued with what he was doing on a couple of fronts. One, that the fact that the company was born digital, it was doing digital work, the speed and the agility by which the work could get done interests me. When we reviewed this paired question, that intrigued me because I thought, well, I'm a very big proponent of descriptive analysis. So anyone who's on the call who knows me knows that, how much I value descriptive analysis and what it can do in an organization. But you're always challenged, right, in terms of time and capacity and money that it costs to support descriptive analysis. And you are always looking to prove its worth. And given his approach, I thought, well, it's kind of interesting. It has some similarities. It's using likers and users of the product category. You're presenting pairs of products. So when you're training descriptive panels, that happens a lot to understand, do the consumers see differences in these products in the way that you expected them to before you put them in a booth to collect data. I like the fact that the information was scalable and that you had large N to work with. So it intrigued me of, could it be another tool to add into the toolbox at Mondelez? So I did put it through its paces. I, tested products that were similar, products that were different. I did the profiling, I did the hedonics. I tested in various countries around the world, and I was very pleased with what I saw. Now, again, it's not a replacement for the trained panel, as Daniel said, it's a complement. And you're going to get really a summary of the product differences because you're going to be limited. You're not going to get 30 and 40 attributes because, the consumer is not going to sit there to go through 1,000 pairs in order to get all the combinations of the attributes that you would need in order to achieve the data and quality and integrity that you need. So you're probably going to be looking at, 10 to 15 maybe summary attributes about the product, but you will have valid and reliable data, which is what I found, and that it can be used to also do modeling, regressions and things that you would with the trained panel. And over the last couple of years in my capacity with FlavorWiki, I have seen it proven out time and time again with a number of clients. And I've even seen where the consumers were actually able to distinguish product differences to a greater degree than many of the train panels that we've seen in companies. So it continues, for me, it continues to validate itself every time I see it being used with the customers of FlavorWiki. And I think it really is a nice addition to the toolbox of a sensory scientist.
Thanks, Marcia, and we'll go into that a little bit more. But next slide, we're going to actually see kind of how it looks. You know, I think it's important. On the right-hand side there's going to be a continuous loop of people of what you'd see in your phone. We do have about I'd say 80% of the people that answer our consumer work do it on a phone, although everything works as well in a PC and a tablet. But as mentioned before, we will present 2 attributes at a time. And we may not present all of the various pairs of those potential attributes to every consumer. So we typically will like to see 8 to 15 attributes being used per modality. So if it's a flavor modality, we will isolate 8 to 15 attributes that are consumer friendly and that work. As Marcia mentioned, if we go beyond that, which we have done, we've done, I think, up to 28 attributes. It just means that the number of these potential pairs between the comparisons that we need to collect becomes much larger. So the requirement of the data collection becomes more cumbersome, but also typically once you get beyond like 15 descriptive flavor attributes for, say, a granola bar, you start to get into language which is not common to a consumer. So you also start to run into more noise in the data, which we can pick up as being indicative of an attribute not being understood. But the basic case is that they'll run through, in this case, we are asking this consumer, you can see there it says answer at least 10 pairs, meaning they could answer more. And if they answer more, that's great. That just gives us more data. But we allow them after answering 10 of these pairs to move on because we want to allow them to move through quickly. And each consumer will do that, or each panelist will do that. And then it will aggregate all that information into this profile. What you'll see here at the end, like that profile there, which is really just for show, we don't typically show that to someone who's taking a test. That's a profile of what that specific person perceived. Of course, as we add more variation within that to more consumers, then we get more specificity in the data. But we are able to get individual level profiling information, which can be very interesting for modeling, even if you think about using that instead of like traditional jar scales and things like this, because it's a lot more efficient than asking many jar questions. So that the basics is that we'll compare those two. And what we always get is questions about like, well, how do you know it's the right descriptors? What do you do in these cases? What if it's not present, et cetera? With consumers, we've really found, and we've tested this many times, that it's best to just ask them to answer. That if they don't understand something, you will get half of the group answering one way and half of the group answering the other way, and the algorithm will process this in the right way. If it's truly that an attribute is not present, it will always be losing because it's always less than something else, and the algorithm will handle that in the right way. However, we do have some different attachments to the question type that you'll see if you watch here as it runs through again, where we're allowing the consumer to say things like, well, that one isn't present, or neither of these are present, or actually there's something present here which I'm not seeing and I would like to enter a customized descriptor. This is usually cases where we're working with people that are more aware of the tasting process, like maybe they're inside a food company, they're maybe employees inside a food company, or they're even trained panelists. We've done it with consumers, but we find that the easiest way to get this information from a consumer is to ask them these very simplified questions. When we do need to do attribute definition, we use some of these cases with consumers, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically, that is the way that the interface looks. Again, the attributes that we use are completely customizable. We can use videos, we can use images for that. We can even attach definitions to that if we wanted to, though, as I mentioned, we tend to not do definitions because we rely instead on the kind of like interpretation of the consumer about that attribute. I'm going to let Elli and Marcia say a few more points about that, maybe in terms of what they've seen in past projects and different learnings they've had. But that's kind of the basics. And if there's any questions, we're happy to answer that. But that's what it would look like in a test if you were to take it.
Yeah. So I think what we could add here is that we can apply this method in multiple different product categories. So it can be beverages, it can be snacks, it can be ready-to-eat meals. So whenever we have a set of attributes or descriptions and we want to measure the relative intensity of an attribute or a description, is where we can use this method. And later on, we will see some use cases, but I would say the biggest one that everyone would think about is the benchmarking. So whenever you want to also compare like more than two products, it's a great method to compare the attributes and the differences between the products. And what is great, as we said, is that you get a relative intensity. So you see like a kind of magnitude of how different a product is to another. So.
Yeah. And one of the other things here is that, you're gaining this information on a monadic basis. So you're evaluating this product and getting that profile. And if you think about adding products over time or having, the consumer do multiple shops or, multiple products in the category, but doing them on an individual basis, then you're able to use that data for benchmarking over time. Some of the issues that you have with the contextual effects go away here, but it is important that as you're defining those attributes, that it should be a collaboration or, taken from the client's, existing lexicon, and ensuring that you have the best complete set of attributes that you want to use to get that summary information.
Thanks. Let's move on. We've got some questions coming in, and we want to make sure we get time for those at the end. So, thank you, Marcia. Elli.
Mm-hmm.
So, Marcia, here's a case. I mean, this is definitely not the first case we did, but I think it's a good example of a case. We've kind of sanitized it. We've combined a few different elements of it, but maybe Marcia, you could take us through how this would work and then how you ended up with what was the value of the output data. Right?
Yeah, certainly. So this is an example of some of the results that you can get when using the paired question and then understanding how it maps and correlates to hedonic information. So in this case, they were blind products. They were products that were packaged. Some of them were marketplace products. Some of them were not. They were used in home. And the consumers did evaluate over a period of time. And we had 200 responses for each of the products. And, you had your traditional hedonic likings, you ran your analysis to determine significant differences in the samples. In this case, we had significant differences, high and low. So that was nice. We got some good distribution of hedonic scores. So we were able to look at, some kind of the higher products, the lower products, and those that were kind of in the middle. And then being able to evaluate each of those products using the paired methodology, we had the profiles of the products, and we could see differences in those products. And there were a few attributes, of course, that if you look in the bottom right, some of those products had, some of the attributes had quite large differences in them, others not so much. But we were able to use that data quantitatively and create models with that. We looked at it a number of different ways. We did some PLS with this. We did some stepwise regression. We looked at ideal profiles, matching to ideal profiles. And we also, in this case, did look at trained panel data, and it was one of the occasions where we found higher differences, which was nice. And you were able to see those things that were key attributes and things that were drivers of preference.
Thanks. And in case people are wondering, I mean, the execution for something like this typically takes between 2 and 3 weeks. I think the fastest we've ever done something like this is 10 days. Small projects can be done in 2 or 3 days of field execution. So it's very continuous, and also allows us, I think, to get some really structured and good output. Okay, so let's keep moving, just in the interest of time. I want to talk a little bit about attributes and where we get them, and because people typically ask about this. Attribute selection is obviously one of the things which I think what we do is very it's very unique and maybe a bit different than maybe what some other data-driven or digital sensory solutions out there are trying to do. We don't try to standardize the attributes. So we use client-based attributes or category-based attributes. Every test we run has the ability to set a separate attribute, a requirement, depending upon what the need is there. Of course, we do standardize cases where we want to, but typically we'll use attributes that are coming from the client. They might be using them in a train panel scenario. We can crowdsource them, and then we even have ways of stress testing the information. But since I'm not the sensory expert, maybe I'll let Elli and Marcia talk a little bit about their experiences in working with the tool and where attribute selection became important, and where it was very straightforward. The majority of the cases that we do work with, the client usually has good attributes that can be condensed into consumer language, but there are other cases where we need to do more work on that.
Yeah, so it is a very collaborative work. So we work very close, with the client for the specific product. If they have already an internal lexicon, we will try to give some guidance so we can incorporate their internal language to the consumer language in such a way that they will have comparable results at the end. So we'll try to match that. Of course, as Marcia said before, if internally a trained panel might be using 35 to 40 attributes, we won't be able to use such a long list of attributes for the consumer. We'll need to condense it and pick the important ones. But yeah, there are other cases that we might not be sure about specific attributes that might be very important for the consumer. In those cases, we even have the ability to launch a digital survey to directly ask the consumers, or even have a small interview with some of the consumers. So how would they describe the product? Do they understand the specific attributes? Would they use a different term? So we take it case by case, but I will leave Marcia say some things about some standard things we know already, like number of attributes, how we know if something is understandable by the consumer. So we also do have some standards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, some of it is, after working with descriptive analysis for so many years, across so many different categories that I've worked on, you do know that there are some attributes that tend to be more difficult for consumers because they have multiple meanings. Things like creamy. Well, you can see creamy, you can taste creamy, you can feel creamy. There also might be some specific words that are important in a product that the technical panel does use, that might have a different lexicon for the consumer. So that's some of the other things that we recognize, particularly as you're going from one country to another. What's the correct label to use for a particular perception? So some of those discussions have to be had with the client. And again, because of the approach that we're using, you could do this work across multiple countries, and then the language becomes important, and an understanding of what that perception is and the fact that you might have a different label for it in a different country, but it's meaning the same thing. So some of those discussions you have to have that we have with our clients to make sure that, in fact, you're getting the best collection of attributes in order to get these profiles from the consumers. And we have done some things where maybe a technical panel has been, particularly in something like flavor houses, where the language that they use can be highly technical. And so we've done some work where that technical panel has developed a language, and then we've had the consumers develop language, and then we come together and decide what are the common words and the words that we want to use with the consumers that will then map to the technical language of the in-house panel.
Yep. There are a couple of questions that relate to this, which I'm going to field now. I just want to say one more thing, is that if after doing the data collection, we find that there is what we call noise in the information, meaning that we see patterns in the data collection that shows that perhaps the attribute is not understood or may be confused with another one. And I like to use an example of some of the early work we did. For those of you who are German speakers, in German, there's two words. One is called luftig and one is called weich. One is airy and one is light. And actually, this two attributes were being used. They came from the customer, that were being used to describe a croissant type of a bread product. And it actually became clear that the consumer understood those two things to more or less mean the same, right? And so what we did is we just collapsed these pairs, because we run an algorithm based on these binary pairs. So if we want to, say, run the attribute profiling and just take out one of the attributes as if it never existed, well, then we can use the remaining ones that were compared in these isolated comparisons to run the same analysis. So the data is very flexible from the perspective of comparing between products, but even from the perspective of distilling data to something that is very usable, even if we maybe would have gotten it wrong in terms of some of those attribute selections. We also have a couple of different algorithms that we use to deal with cases where there's not a lot of difference between two things or two attributes in a product. We won't go into those in this webinar. As I mentioned, we might do some later ones on this, but we've developed several different models to use that. But there are two questions here that I think are good. Marcia, if you want to go ahead, otherwise
Well, I was just going to say
Yeah.
also the quality of that data. So we really didn't talk about, what happens when someone's just clicking randomly or they're going too fast, how we handle the quality check of the data.
Yeah, so because you can imagine these different pairs, it's kind of like counting cards. It's not really possible for the consumer to remember how they've answered. Like they might say that B is greater than A and C is greater than A, but then they might say B is greater than C. So the tool will actually pick up these inconsistencies. We do allow for some of them, but once they get outside of a range, we actually kick out those responses. And on top of that, we're also doing an actual an analog check of whether or not they're doing the tasting using video and photos and receipts and things like this. So one of the nice things is that the paired question, because of the way it's structured, it makes it very difficult for consumers to fill in one of our questionnaires without actually having the product with them, which makes it nice because we can even have better data validation with an iHut scenario in combination with, I mentioned, with some of this multimedia. So we've done a lot of work on that, even looking at timing of the responses and things like this. So we do look at that, and I think that it is important, and the smaller the panel gets, or the smaller the size of the group gets, the more important that is. Usually once you have hedonic significance, you have way more data than you need. And this one of the questions where someone is saying, like you said, 60 to 150 responses, but what is the good ideal data? We usually like to say 60 is the minimum. We've seen cases internally at clients where they're actually doing it internally with testers that they know they can kind of stress test for making sure they're paying very close attention. We've seen panels work as small as 8 very well. Typically, though, as many of you will have experience doing, if you're doing some sort of a hedonic test, you're looking for 120 or 150 responses anyway to gain that significance of difference. And in those cases, we have far more responses than are required to get a robust analysis. In fact, we find significance of difference between changes in products that a trained panel would never find because there's much more nuance in the score, and we have a much larger sample size, as Marcia had mentioned.
Yeah, and if we
Go
can
ahead.
add very quickly, like few points of the questions, is that yes, we do ask consumers if the study requires that about their hedonics, and we also incorporate the third question in there as well in the wider questionnaire. In cases that the objective is really that, we can also combine this data and run PCAs and run ideal profiles. So we can put all these data together and get like a wider picture than just hedonics separately and third question separately. And about how many samples, how many consumers, it's still a sensory method. So the gold standards that we have in the sensory community also applies here. So consumers can taste up to 4 to 5 samples, depending on the complexity of the sample. If they have to add more, they will need to take breaks between days. And about the sample size, as a gold standard, for most of the people, some people might disagree with me, is like 60 people is the absolute minimum for consumers. Of course, if you go to 150 or 200, you're going to get more valid results as you would get for any other question you would ask them, even if this is like, how much do you like the product? And as Daniel already said, for trained panels or semi-trained panels, this can be a bit different because those people are supposed to have a connection with the product, understand the definitions of the attributes more. So there we can go lower as in other methods.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe we can.
Yeah, I think that you even answered some of these questions. I mean, to be clear, our goal is to combine the hedonic information with this sensory collection because it is faster, more cost-effective, much more scalable. And that is, in fact, the outcome is that the fact that we're doing a hedonic test requires that n size anyhow. And then we add in this pairing question response, which gets us a very robust descriptive, and it just is a very nice win-win for the execution of the project, right? So.
Yeah, and I'll just add in here too that for those people who might be selling products that are ingredients to other products or recipes or those kinds of things, the ability to do this again in context, taking pictures, videos of the consumers using it, and answering the paired question as part of the entire scorecard can be very beneficial.
Okay, let's keep moving, Carla. Here's some other questions. How do we understand if they're answering the attribute correctly? I think we covered that. What happens if they answer randomly? What if the consumer doesn't sense the attribute in the sample? We talked about that. If the consumer doesn't sense it, we force them to answer. And then, of course, they're going to choose the winner, which is going to be the one that they do sense. And so that's where that attribute selection is much more important. In cases where we've dealt with internal panels, where we can trust them to say, well, that one's really not present, we actually will allow them to give us that information into the tool, and we'll make adjustments around that. Because we give them those options, it requires that they be, really, we need every person to be really on the ball. As Marcia said, they have more of a connection with the product. But then also, it then allows us to shrink the size of the sample because the precision of each data point we're getting is higher. With the consumer, the precision of any single data point of the consumer, of course, has more variability than a trained internal panel. But given just the large size of numbers that we're getting from those, we're able to factor that out in the algorithm.
Yeah, but of course, we would counsel in discussion that to use your attributes wisely and pick them wisely. And if the attribute isn't present in there, we would suggest it not be there. But sometimes a client might come back and say, yeah, but sometimes it does show up, or it might be an off flavor that sometimes is there that we need to know about. So it's just something to be aware of.
Yeah, and sometimes there are cases that you might want to test 10 different products and use the same list of attributes. So in those cases that we always advise attributes to be present, but in 10 products you might see some differences. In this case, we have the option that Daniel described, that if two attributes are next to each other and none of them is present, the user has the option to indicate that in the tool, and we can analyze the data and remove that attribute from this specific product if needed. So
Okay, let's keep going. I think we got 10 minutes left here. We're going to go through just 3 groups of use cases very quickly. As I mentioned, we'll probably end up doing some follow-ons to this. But when it comes to consumer research, people always ask us, okay, how do you use this? What can you do? We love it when customers come to us and they describe a problem that they're having. And, you know, with the agility of our user base, and with the number of people we have, these are all people, to answer one of the questions that came through, these are all people in our panel, if you want to look at it this way, which are owned by us. They've opted into our terms and conditions. We have the ability to get their home address. We have the ability to get their national ID. We can validate every one of them. We don't work with third-party panel providers. The reason for that is that we need for the user to log into the platform. We need to be able to validate everything they do. We need to be able to track their payment. We just require more knowledge of that consumer than usually a third-party panel provider will give you. It also means that we've become very good at recruiting very specific demographics. Every time we do a study, about 60% of the people that will participate in it will be brand new to our platform. So our team, yes, we have a panel, but it operates much more like an online marketing team. So we have a lot of different channels, social media, recruitment, different referral mechanisms that we're using to target individual people based on behaviors and based on their demographics. A lot of times we find that even third-party panel providers in the early days, we did try to work with them. They just didn't have the diversity of the demographics that we needed. So we just turned to the next best thing, which is doing it all by ourselves. And I think that's very, very valuable because it's very easy to go back and talk to them again, to have an interview with them. If we do an in-home test with market products, and then the client comes and they say, well, now we have a new prototype. Can we send it to those same people? We can do that. We can ship it to them. So just being completely self-contained in this regard is really valuable. Right. But when it comes to types of work we do, benchmarking, as Elli mentioned, is very, very big part of what we're doing. This is comparing several products, looking at the different preference differences between them. That's something that we should do a lot of, and compliance testing. Marcia, maybe you want to take a couple of points, and Elli, because a lot of these areas are actually things that Elli and Marcia have developed much more than when I first started working in the industry. So
okay, I'll just real quick on a couple, and then Elli will jump in. So the compliance check. So again, because these are consumers within the FlavorWiki community, and you can go back to them if need be. But in terms of their ability, if you're doing compliance work or quality work and you want to send people out once a quarter and get 100 impressions, and maybe you want those people to be in multiple geographic locations, or maybe one or multiple countries all at the same time, pick up the product, evaluate the product, get pictures of the shelves, get their experience with it and packaging and the quality of it. That can be done very efficiently and cost effectively with this platform. So that's a nice use. And then the other one I'll just touch on is QSRs and prepared foods, right? Again, everyone's going everywhere with their phone. And if you have the type of product that's at a quick serve restaurant, or, and maybe you're trying something in a particular location, we can get people to that store, that convenience store, that restaurant, that quick serve, have them order the product, evaluate it right there. And then, as Daniel mentioned, in the work that we do, once everything's been validated with the consumer and they've completed the mission, that's when we pay them, and they get reimbursed for the price of the product. So they don't get reimbursed for, above and beyond what they've done in terms of going out in their everyday life and shopping and using products that they normally consume. And QSR is another nice approach to be able to get real-time data and also descriptive information from the consumer in those environments.
Yeah, so maybe what I can say here, mostly around the third question, bringing back the conversation to that, is that about benchmark that Daniel mentioned, benchmark and our third question in general, we're doing this for flavor and texture profiles most of the time. But in many cases, we are using third question to evaluate brand associations, to evaluate consumer emotions, to evaluate the packaging profiles. So for example, we put one attribute next to the other. Is the packaging more premium or more boring? So, and then we create profiles outside of texture and flavor. And my personal favorite as a sensory scientist is the use of third question in dynamic foods and foods that they're multidimensional. And this can be burgers, it can be snacks, it can be sandwiches, wraps. So where you have many modalities of the food, you have the meat inside, you have the bread outside, and with the third question, you're able to see, okay, is the sauce more dominant than main protein in the sandwich or not? So for me, this is my personal favorite because as I have previously trained panels, it was always the question, like, okay, when I have a dynamic product, where do I start from? Do I start from the filling or from the outside? So that's my really personal favorite for the third question.
Great.
Okay, so
Just gonna move on to the next slide, just in the interest of time. I think we're nearly finished. So the other aspect that we group is internal testing. We talked a bunch about panels, semi-trained panels and trained panels. I think that's key. But where we've seen a lot of use case in this is within the supplier industry. So we do work with a fair number of ingredient suppliers. And if you're an ingredient company, you know that you're constantly working with your client to refine a formulation, to decide why don't they like it, why do they like it, what can I change? And so being able to sit with just a small group of people, and rather than getting qualitative feedback on this, getting quantitative information about how the products differ and what you can change, we've seen several customers use this very effectively, depending upon their style of selling and their style of prototyping and their style of working with their customer. But there's a variety of different areas in which this can work. Even attribute definition, like sort of defining standardized ways of defining your entire portfolio so that you can be more data-driven around understanding why are you winning certain briefs and not others. So this is another very interesting area to bring sensory into that, what is already a discussion going on. It's not, again, it's definitely not a replacement for a trained panel when you're talking about 3 or 4 people in a meeting, but it does give you then in an instant a lot of information that you can use to discuss with the customer what is not working in this prototype or formulation that I have now given to you. Right.
And it also can be that's where an individual's profile and that ability to have that could be interesting in like roundtable inspections, right? So everyone does their work independently. They have their individual profile, and then you can look to contrast and compare different opinions about the product.
Last slide, Carla, and then we're almost finished. And I really appreciate that we haven't gotten to all the questions, but I think we can follow up with them afterwards. This is an area where we've been doing a lot more, particularly this year. I think ChatGPT caused a lot more interest in using data to create predictive models. So because we're able to gather this data so cost effectively and efficiently, particularly once we set it up, as Marcia said, you can kind of dip in and get updates. This is kind of the perfect scenario, which we've always thought for feeding generative AI models and also then eventually predictive models. So the idea that we can get this information and then feed it into what's becoming, I think, more accepted in the industry of the use of, predictive information and AI, this is one area where we are seeing both more interest and also investing more as a company in developing more of these models on our own. We, however, I should say, we don't do anything that is black box. So everything we do for clients belongs to the client. And therefore, if we do a model process or a project like this, we do it according to the attributes and the definitions that the client wants. And also then the client ends up being the owner of the model. So just because of confidentiality, which is a big concern of ours, and we work for companies that are also competing in the marketplace, we have a policy of not selling generalized data. When people come to us and ask, like, can you just sell us data, sell us insights? We always do things on a bespoke basis to collect that information. And the same will be true for some of this model building as well, as we potentially and hopefully do much more of it in the future. I really do think that building these long-term models is a key thing for the industry. The world is just moving faster and faster all the time, and cost and speed is always a pressure in research. And we hope to be at the forefront of that. And we think that this descriptive profiling that we've talked about here today is a key part of being able to do that. So. We're at time. As I mentioned, like we'll distribute this. We will be doing more of these types of webinars, not just on the paired question, but on another topic which we love, which is the debate between blind versus branded and why does it matter. So if you stay tuned on your inboxes, we'll be doing a little bit more about that. We can share some cases on blind versus branded, because obviously doing things blind creates more cost, more time, and in the world that's moving faster and faster, we want to understand how can we get this data that's still robust, but also be able to do it quickly. With that, thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Thanks, Marcia. Thanks, Elli. If you want to book a demo or anything, you could go on our website, which is business.flavorwiki.com, or just email us. If you want to scan that QR code, you can even book a meeting directly there from the QR code. But always happy to go into more detail, but stay tuned. We'll probably be publicly sharing more and more information around some of these use cases over the next couple of months. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care. Good night.
Bye-bye.